I stood there in the courthouse hallway, the air sharp with cold and arrogance. My son's voice echoed through the doors. She's slipping. She needs supervision. Supervision. The word stuck to the walls like insult disguised as concern. After 30 years teaching finance, after managing every dollar he ever borrowed, I was now a liability. The bailiff called my name. I straightened my jacket, walked in calm and steady, and placed one document on the judge's desk, his signature giving me power over him. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, thin and official, its edges slightly bent as if even the postman hadn't wanted to touch it for long. Charleston's air was already heavy, the kind that made the curtains sigh in slow motion. Nadine Langford set her coffee cup on the windowsill, staring at the return address stamped in bold, Charleston County Probate Court. Her heart didn't skip, didn't stutter. It simply slowed, like a professor pausing over an exam question she'd already guessed the answer to. She slit the envelope with her nail file, drew out the motion, and read the first line out loud, steady as arithmetic. Petition for guardianship, alleging cognitive decline, financial confusion, and potential dementia. The words didn't sting so much as they confirmed something she'd quietly suspected for months, that Todd had been circling, testing the edges of her life for weak spots. By the time she reached the second paragraph, she'd stopped reading. The script of betrayal was familiar, almost predictable. A son concerned for his mother's well-being, a spouse eager to simplify family finances. It had the cadence of a business memo, not a plea for care. Her phone vibrated beside the unopened sugar bowl. Brittany, this is for your safety. You'll thank us later. Nadine stared at the text until it blurred into the wallpaper's pale pattern. Safety. That was the word Brittany always used when she was about to trespass, on a boundary, a conversation, or a life. She didn't respond. Instead, she picked up her glasses, slid the court papers into a neat stack, and reached for the landline. The cord curled like a question mark as she dialed. "Langford calling," she said when the line clicked. A dry chuckle came through. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Joan Geller's voice still carried that unshakable academic sharpness, each word clipped, deliberate. "They filed it," Nadine said. "They filed it wrong," Joan replied, amusement flattening into a lawyer's satisfaction. "They're calling you unfit while your tax records are cleaner than the mayor's campaign fund. You want my favorite part?" Nadine waited. "They didn't know you still control his power of attorney, did they?" A small smile flickered across Nadine's face, the first of the morning. The sound of it, that single they didn't know, steadied her pulse. "Joan," she said evenly, "they're about to." Outside, the magnolia branches shifted without breeze, as if the whole yard were listening. She hung up and turned toward her desk. Her real fortress, every drawer labeled, every folder cross-referenced. She opened one marked legal, active, removing a slim binder with Todd's name embossed on the spine. The power of attorney document lay there, notarized 6 months ago, his signature crisp and unrevoked. She traced the ink with a fingertip, not sentimentally, but like a scientist verifying data. Across the hall, the grandfather clock chimed 10 times, the rhythm of order. Nadine moved methodically, her mind assembling a plan faster than the humid air could cling to her skin. Copies of her medical evaluations, bank records, a clean bill of health from her cardiologist. She wasn't panicking, she was organizing, because organization was control, and control was something her son had never truly understood. She walked to the kitchen, where sunlight spilled over the marble like diluted honey. On the refrigerator hung Todd's last birthday photo, him grinning beside a cake she'd paid for, his arm draped over Brittany like a public performance. Nadine studied it a moment, then took it down, folded it once, and tucked it behind the court notice. Her phone buzzed again. Another text. Todd this time. Todd. Mom, let's not make this messy. You've been forgetting things. Brittany and I just want to help. She typed a single response but didn't send it. Help yourself, son. Then deleted the draft. She went instead to her study and sat at the desk. The same one she'd graded papers on for 30 years. The oak surface smelled faintly of lemon oil and quiet resolve. She clicked on her computer, opened a new document, and began typing the title in bold. Response to Petition for Guardianship. Nadine M. Langford. The keys made a clean, confident rhythm. Her fingers paused only once, over the word guardianship. The irony wasn't lost on her. Guardianship implied weakness, dependency, but she was the one with the records, the proof, the paper trail. She'd raised a son who understood assets but not accountability, and that was her only regret. By the time the church bells tolled noon, Nadine had already printed the first draft, clipped it neatly, and set it beside the stack of Todd's old loan requests. Each one declined, each one saved. She picked up her phone once more, dialing Joan again. "Ready for discovery?" Joan asked. Nadine looked toward the window where the sky had gone white and still. The air outside as heavy as the pause before a hurricane breaks. "More than ready," she said. "Let's make sure the court remembers who's really competent around here." And as she slipped the petition back into its envelope, she caught her reflection in the glass. Calm, sharp, unswayed. Tomorrow, she'd walk into that courtroom holding a document her son thought didn't exist, his own signature giving her power. He wanted to prove she'd lost control. He just handed her proof he never had it. The next morning broke like parchment. Flat light, no wind. The city muffled beneath humidity so thick it turned the air silver. Nadine was awake before dawn, already dressed, already certain. The coffee brewed behind her like background music while she laid her binder open on the dining table. It was the same binder she'd touched the night before, the one with Todd's name engraved neatly in gold, but now it sat like a weapon disguised as stationery. She turned each page slowly, her reading glasses low on her nose, verifying signatures, stamps, and dates. The document she wanted was toward the back, tabbed in green. Power of Attorney. Todd Langford, executed. November 14th. The notary seal shimmered faintly under the overhead light, and beside it was Todd's familiar slant of a signature, bold, impatient. He'd signed it the week before his gallbladder surgery, when the anesthesiologist insisted on having an agent in case of complication. Todd hadn't read the clauses. He'd just waved the pen, joking, "You'll take care of me if I flatline, right, Mom?" He never revoked it. Nadine set the document beside her cup and stared at it, letting the quiet build its own kind of gravity. She didn't smile this time. Power wasn't something to enjoy. It was something to recognize, to handle like an electrical current. She understood now that Todd's mistake wasn't greed, it was arrogance. He'd assumed she'd forgotten her own paperwork. Joan's voice came through the speakerphone at precisely 8:30. "Morning, Professor Langford," she said. "You sound like a woman with something loaded on her desk." "Original documents," Nadine replied. "Sealed and dated. You were witness on the last page." Joan chuckled. "Still valid. Still binding. He'll hate that." "Then it's serving its purpose." They both paused, the kind of silence lawyers respected. Then Joan's tone shifted, crisp and tactical. "Let's update your living will while we're at it. I'll name myself temporary medical agent. We'll notarize again this week. You want to make this airtight before the hearing?" "I do. I'll bring my clerk over after lunch." "Bring a new file label," Nadine said. "Something clean." After the call, she began pulling out folders from her filing cabinet, medical, financial, correspondence. The process soothed her. Routine had always been her meditation. Each test result, each bank statement, each insurance summary slid neatly into place until the table looked like a map of her life. Orderly, unassailable. But order could feel lonely, too. For a moment, she caught herself glancing toward the empty kitchen doorway, expecting to hear Todd's booming voice teasing her about living in the 70s with all this paper. He'd laughed when she refused to go paperless. "Digital's safer," he'd said. "No one hacks a filing cabinet," she'd shot back. She smiled faintly at the memory, then at how right she'd been. By noon, the clerk arrived with a portable notary stamp and a briefcase that clicked open like a vault. Joan followed, her gray linen jacket pressed, her hair pinned like punctuation. She set her purse down and scanned the table. "You always make my job too easy," she said. "I'm fond of symmetry," Nadine replied. Joan sat, reviewing the documents one by one, her pen gliding across the new living will. "You're naming me medical proxy," she confirmed, "meaning I decide if you're ever declared incapacitated." Nadine nodded. "And I trust you to only sign off when I'm truly gone, or unbearable company." Joan smirked. "You're neither, so I suppose you'll outlive me." The notary pressed the final seal with a soft thunk. It sounded final, official, satisfying. Nadine placed the new documents into a fresh binder labeled Estate, Revised. Joan gathered the originals, stacking them like chess pieces. "Now," she said, "we need to start your defense dossier. Medical competency exams, bank ledgers, medications, anything they could twist." Nadine reached into her drawer and slid a folder forward. "Already printed." Joan's eyebrows lifted. "You really are dangerous when provoked." "I'm efficient," Nadine corrected. By the time they finished, sunlight had thinned into a gray sheen. The table gleamed with signatures and seals, physical proof that Nadine Langford was still the keeper of her own story. Later that evening, as Joan left with the briefcase of duplicates, Nadine's email pinged. A new message from Brittany Langford, family update. The subject line read, "Reaching out before it's too late." She clicked it open. "Hi, Carol," it began, addressed to one of their mutual friends. "I'm worried about Nadine. She's been forgetting appointments, confusing names. Todd and I are stepping in before things get worse. Hope you'll keep her in your prayers." Nadine read it twice, her pulse slow and even. The lie was almost elegant in its tone, soft and performative. Stepping in before things get worse. She printed the email, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and labeled it Exhibit A, Defamation. Then she reached for her pen, signing today's date at the bottom. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the harbor, low, gathering, promising a storm that hadn't yet arrived. Nadine looked up at the sound, her expression unreadable. "Let it come," she murmured. "Everything's documented." Rain whispered against the shutters the next morning. Soft, but steady, like a metronome keeping time for her thoughts. The storm Joan had promised had finally arrived, soaking the azaleas and fogging the glass of Nadine's study. She sat at her desk in her housecoat, hair pinned up, the glow from her laptop screen reflecting off her reading glasses. She wasn't drafting letters or rebuttals now. She was building an archive, an unshakable one. On the screen, a spreadsheet took shape, neat columns labeled date, request, amount, outcome. Nadine typed each entry with surgical precision. January 3rd, Todd requested $25,000 bridge loan for investment firm expansion. Denied. March 14th, Todd asked for early inheritance distribution. Reason, opportunity window. Denied. May 9th, Todd requested co-signature on property refinance. Denied. August 22nd, Todd suggested merging accounts for simplified tax reporting. Denied. Each keystroke sounded like a verdict, At the far end of the table, a small recorder blinked red, quietly documenting the process. Nadine spoke occasionally as she typed, dictating notes to herself. Pattern suggests premeditated access attempts disguised as financial advice. Motive, liquidity, not concern. Her tone was detached, clinical, but beneath it ran a quiet fury. Not the theatrical kind that burns out in a scene, but the low, enduring one that powers a lifetime of discipline. The rain picked up, tapping harder. She rose, poured a cup of coffee, and came back to find her inbox flashing with a new message, social media mention alert, Brittany Langford. She clicked the link. A photo filled the screen, Todd and Brittany smiling on their porch, his arm around her shoulders. The caption read, "It's hard watching loved ones slip, but love means doing what's right, even when they hate you for it." The comments below were predictable. So brave. Sending prayers. Family first. Nadine exhaled slowly, the kind of sigh that carried years of restraint. She took a screenshot, named the file Defamation Exhibit Effroi Social, and moved it into her digital folder. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out her latest cognitive evaluation, dated just 6 weeks prior, signed by Dr. Evans and Dr. Lee. Both results were immaculate, reflexes sharp, memory intact, decision-making unimpaired. She laid the report flat beside her laptop, then reached for her phone. "Charleston Neurological," a receptionist answered after 2 rings. "This is Nadine Langford," she said, tone calm but formal. "I'd like to schedule a third cognitive assessment. Full battery. Same as before." "Of course, Ms. Langford. Any particular reason for another?" "Documentation," Nadine replied simply. They booked her for Friday, 3 days before the hearing. She jotted it neatly into her desk planner, underlining the date twice. As she hung up, she caught her reflection in the dark window. Pale light behind her, rain tracing faint rivers down the glass. There was no tremor in her hand as she typed the final rows of her document. She scrolled back to the top, selected print. The laser hum began, methodical, certain. Minutes later, the papers slid out warm into the tray. She clipped them together and labeled the top page, Financial Requests. Todd Langford, 1-year summary. When Joan arrived just after lunch, umbrella dripping on the porch, she found Nadine standing beside the printer, expression composed. "You look like someone who's already won," Joan said, hanging her coat on the rack. "I'm just ahead on homework," Nadine replied, handing her the stack. Joan scanned the top few pages, eyes narrowing in approval. "This," she said, tapping the list of denials, "is your Exhibit B, conflict of interest, plain as day. He can't claim you're confused when your records are tighter than his credit score." "Good," Nadine said. "I want the judge to see patterns, not pity." Joan smiled. "You'll get both, but for the right reasons." They worked for another hour, labeling, cross-referencing, and adding signatures to document logs. By the time Joan packed up to leave, the rain had stopped, leaving the world outside washed clean and quiet. As Joan stepped onto the porch, she paused. "Anything else you want me to bring to court prep tomorrow?" Nadine hesitated, glancing back toward her desk. The printed photo of Todd and Brittany still glowed on the computer monitor, their performance frozen mid-smile. "Bring a mirror," she said softly. Joan tilted her head. "A mirror? So my son can see what manipulation looks like." Joan gave a short laugh, but her eyes flicked with admiration. "You know, Nadine, I think you've already won this case." Nadine closed the laptop, her movements precise, deliberate. "Winning isn't the goal," she said. "Accuracy is." As the door shut and the locks clicked, the house settled into stillness again. Nadine stood there a moment longer, listening to the faint ticking of the clock. Steady, relentless, unconfused. Then she turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from her printer tray, a single document resting atop the stack, ink still drying, truth still warm. By Thursday morning, Charleston had dried into that deceptive kind of calm that follows a storm: bright air, clean streets, but pressure still hanging somewhere unseen. Nadine's house gleamed under the light that spilled through her bay windows, each surface scrubbed to order. The stillness helped her think. She was drafting affidavits, 4 of them, each one another nail in Todd's petition. Her dining table had become a command center again. She'd already collected her doctor's letters, the first from Dr. Evans, the second from Dr. Lee, each stating unequivocally that her cognition was entirely within the range of normal for age, with no signs of decline. Next came her pharmacist, who wrote in careful, old-fashioned script that Mrs. Langford maintains full awareness of her prescriptions, dosage timing, and interactions, often reminding me what's covered under her plan. The last affidavit came from her mailman, Frank, who'd been delivering to her street for nearly 20 years. Never missed a payment, never mixed up an address. Greets me by name every morning, he'd written, signing the form with a small American flag doodle beside his name. It wasn't professional, but it was human, and truth carried a kind of charm when it was honest. Joan arrived mid-morning, her phone tucked under her chin, a yellow folder clamped beneath one arm. "No, Mr. Adkins," she was saying into the receiver, "you cannot file hearsay letters as evidence. This is a court of law, not a family Facebook group." She hung up and dropped the folder onto the table with a soft thud. That was Todd's lawyer. He's filing statements from Brittany's yoga instructor and 2 of Todd's cousins about your supposed forgetfulness. Nadine didn't even flinch. "They'll look like fools." Joan smiled thinly. "They already do." She began collecting Nadine's affidavits, scanning through each. Doctor, pharmacist, CPA, mailman. You've built a fortress out of facts. Nadine straightened a stack of pages. "You said we'd treat this like federal court." Joan nodded. "And you did. Todd's team is writing a soap opera. We're submitting a dissertation." The notary seal shimmered on each page, catching sunlight as Joan slipped them into a thick, cream-colored envelope. She printed a label in neat black text. Langford, Nadine. Affidavit packet, filed pre-hearing. Nadine watched the motion of Joan's hands, smooth, unhurried, deliberate. That calm competence had always comforted her, the same way her own ledgers and labels did. "Once this packet's filed," Joan said, sealing the flap, "there's no pulling it back. Every one of these becomes part of the record." "That's exactly where I want them," Nadine replied. Joan's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, grimaced. "Brittany's been busy. She's left voicemails for the clerk's office trying to share concerns. You'd think this was a PTA meeting." "I imagine she's getting nervous," Nadine said, moving toward the sideboard to refill their glasses of iced tea. "People tend to when they mistake gossip for evidence." Joan chuckled softly. "You could teach half the attorneys in this county about restraint." When the tea glasses were empty and the envelope sealed, Joan tucked it into her leather briefcase like a treasure map. "I'll walk it down to the clerk's office myself," she said. "No couriers, no digital copies. They'll open it in front of me." Nadine nodded. "I'll be here if you need a sworn addendum." Joan's smile flickered into something warmer. "I know." After she left, the house exhaled again, that deep silence returning like a held breath released. Nadine gathered the leftover papers on the table, notes, checklists, a draft she'd annotated in red. She was about to turn off her desk lamp when her phone buzzed, a voice memo, from Brittany. She hesitated for a second before pressing play. "Hi Nadine, it's Brittany. Look, I know things have gotten complicated, but please don't embarrass Todd in front of the judge. He's only trying to protect you. If you fight this, it'll just look bad for everyone." Maybe, maybe let it go, okay? The tone was syrupy, practiced, a veneer of concern covering calculation. Nadine listened all the way through, not out of curiosity, but out of precision. When the recording ended, she played it again, then once more, letting each word settle. She forwarded the file to Joan with a single-line message. Subject, additional exhibit body. For the record. Then she deleted the original from her phone, clearing the notification, wiping the digital trace clean. For a moment she stood by the window, watching sunlight fracture against the wet pavement outside. Across the street, the magnolia leaves still dripped from the night's rain, their surfaces gleaming like polished glass. "Please don't embarrass Todd," she whispered, almost to herself. The words tasted faintly bitter. He's managed that just fine on his own. The clock struck noon, each chime sharp and certain. Nadine returned to her desk, took up her fountain pen, and wrote a note on her calendar for the next day. Clerk's office, filing complete. Evidence, airtight. She underlined it once, then set her pen down. Steady hand, unflinching eyes. Because in less than 24 hours, every word her son had weaponized would be turned into a public record, and she'd made sure not a single one could be rewritten. Friday morning opened with that unnatural hush before a thunderstorm, even though the sky was clear. The air in downtown Charleston clung close, thick, charged, expectant. Nadine Langford walked through the courthouse doors at precisely 8:45 a.m., heels clicking like a metronome against the polished tile. Inside the probate courtroom, the air conditioning hummed faintly, cool and indifferent. Todd was already there, seated beside his attorney at the plaintiff's table, a tower of paper stacked in front of him like armor. Brittany sat just behind, clutching a tissue and whispering theatrically to anyone within earshot. Todd looked every bit the confident son. The tailored navy suit, the curated grief on his face, the faint smirk that said, "I've already won." He didn't see Nadine at first. Joan had told her to wait in the corridor until they were called. "You walk in last," Joan had said that morning, fastening a pearl pin to Nadine's lapel. "Not because you're late, because you're in control." So she waited. Inside, Judge Melissa Crane took the bench, efficient, unsentimental reading glasses balanced halfway down her nose. "Let's begin," she said, her tone trimmed of ceremony. "Langford guardianship petition." Todd's lawyer rose, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, we're here today to ensure Mrs. Langford's safety and financial stability. My client has growing concerns regarding his mother's declining cognition." The door opened. Every head turned. Nadine stepped in. Crisp ivory suit. Silver hair pinned back in perfect symmetry. No cane, no handler, no family escort. Just Joan, walking a half step behind, briefcase in hand. The bailiff closed the door quietly behind them. Nadine took her seat at the respondent's table, laying one leather folder in front of her. She didn't look at Todd. She didn't need to. The sound of his chair shifting told her everything. Surprise, then discomfort. Judge Crane peered over her glasses. "Mrs. Langford, you're representing yourself?" Joan rose smoothly. "Joan Geller, counsel for Mrs. Langford. We've filed our appearance and accompanying affidavits with the clerk this morning." Judge Crane nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. "Proceed." Todd's lawyer continued, voice buoyed by false confidence. "We've submitted a number of statements from family members and acquaintances, concerns about memory lapses, misplaced documents, forgetfulness." Joan interrupted, polite but firm. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. None of these statements are from licensed professionals." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have supporting documentation from any medical authority, counselor?" Todd's lawyer hesitated. "At this time, no. Then let's not waste the court's morning." Judge Crane gestured toward Joan. "Defense?" Joan placed her hand lightly on Nadine's shoulder, then stepped forward. "Your Honor, My client would like to submit one item for review. Nadine rose, calm as breath, and crossed the short distance to the bench. She handed the judge a single folder, black leather, gold initials embossed. No theatrics, no flourish. Inside, Jones said, you'll find 3 certified cognitive evaluations, all current and unblemished, bank statements reflecting complete financial clarity, and 1 active legal document that may clarify the matter of authority. Judge Crane opened the folder. The courtroom was silent but for the sound of paper shifting under her fingertips. Then came the pause, the faint inhale. She flipped back a page, reread, then looked up. Power of attorney, she said slowly. Executed by Todd Langford in favor of the respondent. 6 months ago. Todd blinked. What? Joan didn't look at him. He signed it prior to minor surgery, Your Honor. It was never revoked, notarized, or amended. Which means, by state law, Mrs. Langford remains his legal agent. Brittany's tissue froze halfway to her cheek. Todd's lawyer shuffled his papers, color draining from his face. Judge Crane adjusted her glasses again, voice crisp. Mr. Langford, is this your signature? Todd leaned forward, staring at the document as though it had been conjured from air. I guess it is, but that was temporary. Did you revoke it? No, but... Then it remains valid. Silence. Even the air conditioner seemed to stop humming. Joan clasped her hands behind her back, expression composed. Your Honor, in light of this revelation, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of the guardianship petition, with prejudice. Judge Crane closed the folder with deliberate care. She turned her gaze to Todd. Steady, judicial, unblinking. Mr. Langford, she said finally, you filed a motion claiming your mother incapable of managing her own affairs. Yes, Your Honor, because... And yet you granted her power of attorney over you. He opened his mouth, but no words came. She never returned it. The judge continued, voice low, unmistakable. Which means that, at this moment, legally, she retains authority over you. The courtroom rippled. Audible gasps, a cough, the faint squeak of Brittany's chair as she sank lower. Joan's face didn't change. Nadine simply adjusted her papers, calm and poised, as though this were merely another line item being checked off a list. Judge Crane leaned back, eyes still on Todd. You may want to reconsider who in this room needs protection. Then she turned to the bailiff. Enter the defense documents into record, hearing adjourned for review. The gavel struck once, clean, final, echoing. Todd's hand went slack around his pen. Brittany dabbed at air that no longer required tears. Nadine stood, collected her empty folder, and looked her son in the eye for the first time that morning. I warned you, she said quietly, to respect paper. And as she turned to leave, the sound of her heels marked the only rhythm in a courtroom that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. The courtroom reconvened on Monday, the air inside heavier than before, quiet, cautious, the way people act when they know someone has brought a loaded file to a knife fight. Todd's earlier bravado was gone, replaced by an anxious stillness he tried to disguise as composure. Brittany clutched a slim purse in her lap, her knuckles the color of chalk. Nadine sat perfectly still at the defense table, posture straight, her binder open to a single tab labeled Competency Documentation. Joan stood beside her, crisp as pressed linen, scanning her notes one final time. Judge Crane entered promptly at 9. All right, she said, her voice even but clipped. I've reviewed the filings from Friday. I believe the court owes Mrs. Langford the courtesy of hearing the remainder of her submission. Joan nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. My client is prepared to provide further supporting documentation. Nadine rose, the movement deliberate but effortless. She stepped forward, handed a new folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the bench. This, Joan said, is a cognitive assessment dated 3 days ago, Friday morning. Full evaluation by Charleston Neurological Associates. Both physicians signed off. No impairment, no cognitive decline, no dementia indicators of any kind. Judge Crane turned the pages slowly, her expression giving nothing away. Recent, she said. Impressively so. Todd's lawyer cleared his throat. Your Honor, we weren't aware there had been any updated medical evaluations. Joan's tone was silk with an edge. Because no one asked, counselor. You assumed. The words landed like a scalpel. Todd's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, pretending to consult his notes. Well, that may be so, but... Let's move to the financial evidence, Joan said, overriding him cleanly. Mrs. Langford, if you would. Nadine picked up a sheet from her binder, typed columns, highlighted dates, and began to read, her voice steady as rainfall. January 3rd. Todd Langford requested a $25,000 bridge loan for business expansion, declined. March 14th. Requested early inheritance distribution, reason stated. Opportunity window, declined. May 9th. Co-sign request for property refinance, declined. August 22nd. Proposed merged accounts for simplified taxes, declined. Each word was measured, every syllable deliberate. The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratch of the clerk's pen recording testimony. Each request, Nadine continued, was accompanied by assurances that he'd handle the details. Each declined for the same reason: lack of documentation. Joan stepped closer to the bench. We're submitting this as Exhibit C. You'll find corresponding bank statements, email exchanges, and verification from Mrs. Langford's accountant. Judge Crane flipped through the attachments, brow furrowed. Everything's dated and signed. Yes, Your Honor. Todd's lawyer opened his mouth again, then closed it when Joan handed over the next document. Additionally, she said, we've included electronic payment records, Venmo transactions from Mrs. Langford to her daughter-in-law Brittany, each one labeled as temporary reimbursement, none repaid. Brittany's breath hitched. That's not... Those were for family things, she whispered, but the microphone caught it. Joan didn't look at her. $200 on March 8th, $1,900 on April 10th, $2,350 on June 5th. Repeated requests phrased as, just until Todd's bonus clears. Brittany's lawyer instinct, if she had one, didn't exist. Her face flushed pale pink, and her eyes darted toward Todd, who was now visibly sweating through his collar. Judge Crane studied the line items, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. Do you have receipts to support those transfers? Screenshots, bank verifications, and timestamps, Joan replied. All filed in Exhibit D. Todd's lawyer tried again, voice cracking under its own strain. Your Honor, these records aren't directly relevant to the question of competence. Oh, but they are, Joan cut in, sharp and unyielding. Because we are not only defending competence, Your Honor, we're defending boundaries. When a son attempts to exploit trust under the pretense of concern, that is not caregiving. That is coercion. The judge said nothing, but the silence that followed her words was seismic. Even the bailiff looked up from his notes. Todd slumped slightly, eyes on the table. Brittany had gone still. The tissue crumpled in her lap. The tower of papers Todd had brought on Friday, his supposed evidence, now looked flimsy, childish beside Nadine's single folder of clean, dated facts. Judge Crane turned one final page, her tone softer now, though it carried the weight of authority. Mrs. Langford, you seem to have a clear grasp of your financial and legal affairs. I taught finance for 30 years, Nadine said evenly. I wouldn't misplace a decimal, Your Honor. A faint smile touched the judge's lips, then disappeared as she closed the folder. These documents will remain on record. I'll review them fully before issuing my ruling. Todd's lawyer sank into his seat, whispering something frantic. Joan gathered her materials with surgical calm. "Thank you, Your Honor. That concludes our submission for today." As the gavel sounded for recess, Todd's chair screeched against the floor, the sound too loud in the hush. Nadine didn't turn toward him, but she felt the heat of his stare as she packed her binder. Every movement precise, unhurried, absolute. Joan leaned closer, voice low enough for only Nadine to hear. "He's unraveling." Nadine glanced toward the bench where Judge Crane was already standing, folder in hand. "Good," she said. "Let him watch the record replace his story." And when she turned to leave, Brittany's whisper trembled behind her, raw, unguarded. "Todd, what if she wins?" Nadine didn't stop walking. She didn't need to, because in that moment, every document she'd filed had already started speaking louder than her son ever could. By Tuesday, the courtroom had lost its tension, but not its edge. The audience was smaller, fewer curious onlookers, more people who now understood that Nadine Langford wasn't there to play victim. She was there to dismantle a performance. Todd sat straighter than before, his jaw set, his tie knotted too tight. Brittany was quieter, though her eyes still scanned the room as if rehearsing sympathy. When Judge Crane entered, both of them stood, obedient but brittle. "Let's proceed," the judge said, flipping open her notes. "Mr. Langford, you wish to elaborate on your concerns regarding your mother's finances?" Todd's lawyer rose. His tone had softened since the last hearing, careful now. "Yes, Your Honor. My client maintains that Mrs. Langford has been exhibiting questionable financial behavior, namely a series of irregular donations and unexplained withdrawals." Judge Crane glanced over her glasses. "Irregular in what sense?" Todd spoke up, eager to reclaim the floor. "She's been donating to random causes, things she doesn't even remember. I mean, she sent money to 3 different environmental groups last spring and didn't recognize the names when I asked. She's also mailed checks to local shelters she's never visited." He turned to Nadine with a look meant to sound pained. "I'm worried she's being taken advantage of." Nadine folded her hands in her lap, expression unreadable. Joan rose. "Your Honor, may we enter Exhibit E?" Judge Crane gestured for her to continue. Joan handed up a thin packet, just 5 pages. "Mrs. Langford's charitable log. Every transaction is verified, recurring, and modest. $75 monthly to the Humane League, $50 to the Charleston Literacy Trust, $100 to the local food bank. All charities she's contributed to for years." She turned toward Todd, voice soft but exact. "These aren't erratic decisions. They're consistent generosity." Judge Crane reviewed the pages, lips pursed in thought. "Everything's accounted for, Mr. Langford. Your claim of strange donations appears unsupported." Todd's lawyer shuffled his papers, but Todd cut in before he could interject. "That's not the only thing, Your Honor. There was a $9,000 check she tried to write to cash. I found it in her desk drawer. Unsigned. She couldn't even tell me what it was for." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Nadine tilted her head slightly as though studying him under classroom light. Joan didn't flinch. "Your Honor, may my client clarify that?" "Go ahead," the judge said. Nadine stood, every movement composed. "The check in question," she began, "wasn't mine to explain. Todd asked me to write it. To cash." His words. "He said he'd handle the deposit himself. I declined. That's why it was left unsigned." Todd's mouth opened. No, that's not." Brittany leaned forward, voice low but loud enough to carry. "That was for investment, Todd, remember? You said—" The room froze. Judge Crane's gaze swung to Brittany. "Mrs. Langford, are you confirming that request came from your husband?" Brittany's color drained. I meant, just—" "He was trying to help manage," Joan interjected smoothly, sliding another document toward the bailiff. "Your Honor, Exhibit F, A photocopy of that same check, preserved by my client. The memo line reads, and I quote, "For me, she'll forget." Todd blinked, his composure cracking like thin glass. "That's not my handwriting." Joan raised one brow. "We anticipated that denial. The handwriting has already been compared by Mrs. Langford's CPA, who confirmed it matches previous endorsements made by Mr. Langford on joint account checks." Judge Crane lifted the photocopy, holding it up so the fluorescent light revealed the faint indent of the writing. She studied it a moment, expression unreadable, then looked directly at Todd. "Mr. Langford," she said slowly, "you told this court your mother was acting irresponsibly with her money, but from what I can see, the only questionable behavior involves a son trying to extract funds under the pretense of protection." Todd's lawyer started to protest. "Your Honor, that's not fair." But the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Fair?" she repeated. "What's fair is the truth on record. What's not fair is exploiting family under the guise of concern." A flush rose up Todd's neck, angry and hot. Brittany shifted, eyes darting toward the floor. Joan closed her binder with quiet finality. "No further comment, Your Honor." Judge Crane leaned back, tapping her pen against the bench, each click echoing in the quiet room. "I will review these exhibits overnight," she said. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for the court's decision." She stood, robe sweeping like punctuation at the end of a sentence. "Until then, I strongly advise all parties to reflect on motive and on memory." The gavel came down once, sharp as a verdict. Nadine didn't move until the room began to clear. Then she rose, met Todd's furious stare, and said softly, "You should have remembered what you wrote." And as she left the courtroom, the sound of that gavel still ringing behind her, she knew the next morning wouldn't be a hearing. It would be reckoning. The next morning, the courthouse felt colder. The air carried that particular hush that follows humiliation. Todd's, Brittany's, the lawyers. Even the clerk avoided looking their way as they shuffled back into the same courtroom that now seemed smaller, closer, like the walls themselves had begun listening. Nadine arrived last, as always, escorted only by Joan, whose heels struck the tile like the countdown of a clock. No folder this time, no stack of papers. Just a slim envelope tucked beneath Nadine's arm, and the quiet confidence of a woman who'd already shifted the ground under her son's feet. Judge Crane entered briskly, her tone curt but not unkind. "Court is now in session. Mrs. Langford, Mr. Langford. We will continue where we left off." She looked at Joan. "Counsel, you may proceed." Joan rose, voice steady. "Your Honor, the defense is filing a motion for injunctive protection under Rule 65. We are requesting that Mr. Langford be temporarily prohibited from initiating or managing any financial transactions, communications, or advisory roles regarding Mrs. Langford's affairs, pending review of his conduct." The room froze. Todd's lawyer blinked. Your Honor, that's absurd. My client has every right to contact his mother. He's her family." Todd added sharply, "She's my mother." Judge Crane's eyes didn't flicker. "She's also," she said slowly, "your legal power of attorney. You granted her that authority." The words landed like a gavel before the actual one had a chance to fall. Todd leaned forward, his tone slipping into that familiar mix of arrogance and disbelief. "This isn't what that document was meant for. She was supposed to protect me if something happened. Medical stuff. Not this." Joan remained unshaken. "Intent does not override execution, Your Honor." He signed broad authority. It was never rescinded. It remains active. Judge Crane turned to Nadine. "Mrs. Langford, do you wish to exercise your authority under this document?" Nadine stood slowly, the movement precise, measured, like a professor answering her own test question. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, "and I'm exercising that now." Todd half rose from his chair. This is insane. You can't just— Sit down, Mr. Langford. Judge Crane's tone cut through the air like a blade. You are in a courtroom, not a kitchen argument. Brittany reached over, placing a hand on Todd's arm, whispering something that was supposed to sound supportive. But then she couldn't resist herself, her voice rising just enough to carry. She's twisting everything, Your Honor. Todd's only ever tried to help her. Judge Crane's gaze snapped to her. Mrs. Langford, unless you are testifying, do not speak out of turn again. Brittany sank back into her chair, face pale, fingers tightening on her purse. Joan stepped forward, calm as ever. Your Honor, under Mrs. Langford's existing authority, we are requesting immediate enforcement of a financial boundary, specifically, to freeze all joint or co-managed accounts held in both parties' names. Todd's lawyer sputtered. There are no such accounts active. Joan opened the slim envelope. There are, Your Honor. Account 2149, First Charleston Bank. Primary signer, Mrs. Langford. Secondary signer, Todd Langford. Monthly withdrawals over the past 6 months exceed $30,000, each one marked consulting fee. There is no evidence of consulting services rendered. A sound escaped Brittany, small, involuntary, the kind that slips out when someone realizes the paper trail has teeth. Todd's lawyer flipped through his notes with shaking hands, searching for a rebuttal that didn't exist. Judge Crane looked up from the printout. Mr. Langford, is this information accurate? Todd hesitated. There's context to those transactions. There always is, Nadine said softly, but the words cut sharper than accusation. The judge's pen hovered for only a second before she began writing. Motion granted, she said. Effective immediately. All joint accounts are to be frozen pending further review by the court. Mr. Langford will refrain from any financial or managerial contact with the respondent. The bailiff took the paperwork from her hand, his boots echoing as he crossed to the clerk's table. Todd's lawyer tried one last time. Your Honor, this is extreme. She's isolating him from his family. Judge Crane didn't look up. No, she said, signing the order with a clean stroke of ink. She's defining boundaries you refuse to respect. The courtroom went still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause mid-tick. Joan leaned toward Nadine. You're up, Professor. Nadine took the pen the clerk offered her. She signed the bottom of the page, slowly, firmly, each loop and line deliberate, her handwriting crisp against the pale blue form. When she handed it back, she looked straight at her son. You said you wanted to protect me, Todd, she said quietly. Now you finally are. Todd's expression twisted, part disbelief, part fury, part recognition that something irreversible had just shifted. Brittany reached for him, but he didn't move. Judge Crane stood. This hearing is adjourned until tomorrow, and Mr. Langford, do not test the meaning of an injunction. The gavel came down once, clean and final. As the sound faded, Nadine turned toward Joan, her voice low but steady. It's strange, she murmured. For once he can't touch what's mine. Joan gave her a small, knowing smile. No, Nadine. Now he can only watch. And behind them, Todd stayed seated long after the courtroom emptied. Hands gripping the edge of the table, eyes on the order that had just erased every advantage he thought he had. The morning of judgment arrived with Charleston's sky the color of pewter, heavy, unmoving, the air thick with what felt like consequence. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of polish and nerves. Nadine Langford waited outside courtroom 3, calm amid the murmurs of clerks and shuffling papers. Joan stood beside her, immaculate in navy, her posture as straight as a verdict. Last day, Joan said quietly. Nadine adjusted the cuff of her jacket. Last page, she replied. Inside, Todd was already seated, shoulders rigid, lips pressed into a thin line. Brittany perched beside him like someone trying to appear smaller than the disaster she'd helped create. Todd's lawyer, now visibly drained, kept checking his watch as if hoping time might rewrite evidence. When Judge Crane entered, the courtroom rose. Her tone carried no ceremony. "Be seated. I've reviewed all filings, exhibits, and testimony." She paused, looking first at Nadine, then at Todd. "It's time for a ruling." Todd's knuckles whitened against the table edge. "Mr. Langford," the judge began, "you filed a petition alleging cognitive decline, confusion, and potential dementia in your mother. You cited financial irregularities and memory issues. What the record reflects, however, is an absence of proof and a presence of intent." The words settled over the room like dust. Judge Crane continued, voice level but deliberate. "Mrs. Langford's competency has been established beyond question. The cognitive evaluations, 3 in total, are clear. The financial documentation, consistent. The testimonies, credible." She looked down at her notes, then directly back at Todd. "Your petition was not based on care. It was built on presumption, and greed thinly disguised as concern." Todd opened his mouth, but no sound came. "Therefore," Judge Crane said, setting her pen aside, "this court officially dismisses the guardianship petition with prejudice. It may not be refiled." The phrase landed with an almost physical weight. "With prejudice" meant the end. No retrial, no revision, no second attempt. Brittany's lips parted. "Your Honor, could the court consider some kind of—" Judge Crane turned her gaze, sharp as glass. "This court does not grant consideration to those who misrepresent fact." The silence that followed felt like a held breath across the entire room. Joan rose slowly. "Your Honor," she said, voice measured, respectful, but cutting clean through the quiet. "The defense requests that court costs be reimbursed by the petitioner. My client should not bear the financial burden of defending herself against unfounded claims." Judge Crane didn't hesitate. "Granted in full." She signed the form before the clerk could even finish reaching for it. "All costs associated with the defense are to be paid by Mr. Langford within 30 days. Todd's face went pale, then red. He looked as if he'd forgotten how to blink. "That's— Your Honor, this isn't fair." The judge's voice was calm, but final. "Mr. Langford, fairness is the only reason we're here. You used this court to try to seize control of an independent woman's life. You wasted judicial resources and violated the intent of guardianship law. That is not care. That is coercion." Brittany touched Todd's sleeve, whispering something frantic. He pulled away. Judge Crane adjusted her glasses, eyes narrowing slightly. "Furthermore," she added, "given the nature of this proceeding and its documentation, the court will issue a public reprimand for abuse of legal process." The words seemed to echo longer than the gavel ever could. Todd's lawyer stiffened. "Your Honor, surely that's unnecessary." "It's entirely necessary," Judge Crane said, her tone like steel behind silk. "This reprimand will be entered into the civil record under Mr. Langford's name. It will stand as an example of what happens when guardianship statutes are weaponized for personal gain." Todd sank back into his chair, the weight of the statement hitting him harder than any fine could. His breathing turned shallow. His lawyer leaned in, whispering damage control that sounded like defeat. Joan leaned over to Nadine. "That's it," she whispered. "It's done." But Nadine didn't smile. She simply watched the judge's pen scratch her son's name into permanence, a name now tethered to his own attempt at deception. Judge Crane looked toward Nadine. "Mrs. Langford, the court commends your composure throughout these proceedings. Most individuals under attack would have responded with anger. You responded with evidence." "Evidence doesn't lose its temper," Nadine said softly. A faint smirk ghosted across the judge's face. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." Then she lifted the gavel and brought it down once, sharp resonant, conclusive. Case dismissed. The courtroom stirred to life, benches creaking, whispers rising. Todd didn't move. Brittany wiped her eyes, though no tears had fallen. Joan began packing her briefcase, methodical and serene. "You humiliated him," she murmured, quietly, thoroughly, legally. Nadine rose, straightening her jacket. "I didn't humiliate him," she said. "He documented that himself." As they stepped toward the door, the clerk called after them. "Mrs. Langford, Judge Crane requested a copy of your organizational ledger, for reference in judicial training." Nadine turned, eyes steady. "Tell her she's welcome to it. Everything's labeled." Joan's smile broke at last. "I think that's the first time in this courtroom someone meant that literally." Nadine gave a small nod and walked into the bright hall, the echo of the gavel still following like a drumbeat behind her. And in the quiet wake of her footsteps, Todd Langford sat motionless, staring at the empty bench, realizing too late that his own name, his signature, his arrogance, had written the ending he never expected. By Friday, Charleston was talking, not loudly, not cruelly, but with that soft hum of fascination that passes through small cities when someone dismantles power with paper instead of scandal. The Post and Courier ran a 2-page feature under the headline, "Power of Attorney Turned the Table. Elderly Professor Defends Herself in Court and Wins." The article was careful, factual, even admiring. It didn't name Todd or Brittany, but everyone in their circle knew exactly who the petitioner's son and his spouse were. Nadine read it once over her morning tea, folded the paper in thirds, and slid it beneath a stack of property tax receipts. She didn't gloat. She didn't clip it for the fridge. Public vindication was for people who needed witnesses. She'd always trusted the record more than the rumor. Joan, however, had no such restraint. By 9 that morning, her phone had buzzed half a dozen times. Probate attorneys, estate planners, even a law professor from Columbia. Each of them wanted a copy of Nadine's system, the labeled binders, the affidavit structure, the evidence sequencing. "Your documentation method's becoming legend," Joan said when she called later that day. "I've already been asked if you'll speak at the next legal aid seminar." Nadine smiled faintly into her coffee. "Let's not make a spectacle of competence." "Too late," Joan said dryly. "You've set a new bar for every client with a controlling son and a color-coded file cabinet." Nadine let out the softest laugh, a rare one. "I suppose that's one kind of legacy." By Saturday, Todd's silence was louder than any headline. He didn't return calls from cousins or answer texts from his old colleagues at the investment firm. Someone said he'd taken a leave of absence. Someone else claimed he'd been asked to. Brittany, meanwhile, had quietly deleted her social media. Gone were the curated posts about family first and protecting loved ones. Her accounts vanished overnight, photos scrubbed, captions erased, the digital version of a reputation in retreat. The Langford name still carried weight in Charleston, but now it was whispered with a mix of awe and caution. Not because of Todd's downfall, but because his 73-year-old mother had outmaneuvered him with composure sharper than litigation. By the following week, Joan insisted on taking Nadine to lunch at a quiet waterfront bistro, somewhere shaded, discreet. The kind of place where conversation could be private, but the oysters still arrived chilled. Nadine wore her usual cream blouse, pressed slacks, hair pinned with precision. Joan arrived 5 minutes late, her briefcase still slung over one shoulder. "Before you start," Nadine said, "I'm not celebrating." Joan smirked. "That's good. You'd make a terrible champagne drinker." They ordered iced tea, no dessert, and let the silence sit for a moment. The kind of silence shared by people who'd been through a battle together and emerged, tired, unbruised, but changed. Joan set her napkin down. "You humiliated him without raising your voice." Nadine stirred her tea slowly, the spoon clinking once against the glass. I didn't need to win, she said. I needed it on record. Joan studied her for a long moment. The lawyer's analytical gaze softened into friendship. That's what scares men like Todd. You don't fight them. You document them. Nadine's smile was small, fleeting. Paper doesn't yell. It remembers. Outside, a breeze moved off the harbor, carrying the faint scent of salt and magnolia. For the first time in months, Nadine felt her pulse steady without the weight of strategy behind it. The quiet wasn't defense anymore, it was freedom. Joan checked her phone as a new message buzzed through. One of the attorneys from Atlanta wants to adapt your filing process into a continuing ED module. They're calling it the Langford Protocol. Nadine arched an eyebrow. Sounds clinical. It is, Joan said, and surgical. They both smiled then, not the victorious kind, but the private one shared by two women who understood the quiet satisfaction of proof standing taller than ego. After lunch, Nadine insisted on paying. When Joan protested, she replied simply, I have a court order confirming I can handle my own finances. They laughed softly as they walked out into the bright Charleston sun. Later that evening, back home, Nadine stood by her window watching dusk slide over the street. The magnolia branches shifted in the wind, the same way they had the morning she'd opened that first envelope. Only now, the air felt lighter. No storm coming, just calm. Her phone buzzed on the table. A voicemail notification. The number was familiar, Todd's area code. She stared at it for a moment, unreadable. Then she pressed delete without listening. Across the quiet of her living room, the clock chimed 6 times. Steady as ever. She poured herself one last cup of tea and whispered to the empty air, the record stands. But as she turned off the light, her reflection in the window caught her by surprise. Steady, confident, almost serene. Almost. Because somewhere deep beneath that calm, she knew the Langford name hadn't finished echoing yet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, just her name printed neatly in Todd's too careful handwriting. The envelope was thick, expensive, the kind used for wedding invitations or damage control. Nadine found it wedged between her electric bill and the new issue of The Atlantic, as if contrition could be slipped quietly into routine mail. She held it up to the light, half expecting to see the words bleed through, but there was only the faint outline of a single sheet inside. No weight of sincerity. No urgency. Just formality pretending to be feeling. Still, she carried it to her desk, sliced the top open with her letter opener, and unfolded the page. Mom, I regret how things went. Maybe we can reset. We've both said things that were hard to take back. Brittany and I just want what's best for you and the family. I hope you'll think about that. Todd. No mention of the petition, no mention of the lies in court or the money quietly siphoned from accounts. Not even a line acknowledging the humiliation he'd tried to orchestrate. Just the sterile language of someone drafting a performance review. Nadine read it twice, then set it flat on the desk blotter. She could almost hear Joan's voice in her head, crisp and dry. Reads like a resume cover letter. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile reserved for confirmation of expectations. At 11 o'clock sharp, she called Joan anyway. You were right, she said. Joan's voice came through warm, sardonic. About which part? The apology. It's formatted like he's applying for the position of redeemed son. Joan chuckled softly. Does he get an interview? Not this fiscal year. They let silence stretch for a moment, comfortable as always, before Nadine said, I'm filing it. Under what category? No response needed. Joan laughed outright this time. That's cold. It's clean, Nadine corrected. She hung up, smoothed the page once, and placed it in a clear plastic sleeve. Then she slid it into a black binder labeled Correspondence. Resolved. Her hand lingered there for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle. Not heavy, but certain. By evening, she'd forgotten about the letter until her laptop chimed. A new email. Unknown sender. Subject line, reaching out. The address was new, but the name wasn't. Brittany L. Nadine hesitated, the cursor hovering above the unopened message. Finally, she clicked. Hi Nadine, it's Brittany. I had to make a new account. Too much online negativity lately. Anyway, I know things have been complicated. Todd's been going through a lot, and I just think we should all take a breath. The kids miss you. Do you still want to be in their lives? Let's talk soon. There it was. That familiar manipulation wrapped in politeness, the guilt tied up with a bow of family concern. The phrasing wasn't accidental. Do you still want to be in their lives? The insinuation was surgical. Your silence means abandonment. Your boundaries mean cruelty. Nadine exhaled slowly. She didn't reply. Instead, she clicked forward, typed Joan's address, and wrote nothing in the body. Just the subject line. For record. 5 minutes later, Joan replied. Filed under pattern. Emotional leverage. Nadine stared at the screen, a small laugh escaping her. Quiet but genuine. The house was still, her walls lined with order, labeled binders, sealed envelopes, the architecture of self-protection. But somewhere inside that stillness, she felt something unexpected. A dull ache, like the echo of a sound long faded. She went to the window, where dusk was sinking fast, painting the harbor in violet light. The magnolias outside were still, but she imagined their roots, deep, wide, unshaken by the storms that came and went above them. Her phone buzzed once, another text from an unfamiliar number. She didn't open it. Didn't need to. The story always wrote itself the same way. Instead, she sat down at her desk, opened a fresh file folder, and labeled it in neat block letters. Closure, pending. She placed a blank sheet of paper inside. Nothing written, nothing signed. Just space, reserved for whatever came next. The clock ticked quietly in the background, steady and certain, the same as it had through everything. And though the house was silent, Nadine could almost hear the words she'd spoken to Joan months ago, echoing faintly now. Paper doesn't yell, it remembers. But as she looked at that empty folder, a thought flickered through her mind, one she didn't speak aloud. And sometimes, it waits. By Wednesday, Nadine decided silence wasn't enough. Silence kept her safe, but security kept her sovereign. The first thing she did was unplug her desktop computer, not because she was afraid of hackers, but because she'd learned long ago that every vulnerability started with convenience. The machine had served her for 12 years, reliable, predictable, slow only in the ways that mirrored her patience. She set her coffee on the desk, cracked her knuckles, and began. New passwords, 12 of them, each one generated by a program Joan's office had recommended. Strings of letters and symbols so random they were immune to sentiment. No birthdays, no initials, no trace of meaning. She wrote each one by hand on acid-free paper, sealed them in separate envelopes, and filed them under a tab marked Access, Secured. The air felt cooler when she was done. Next came the phone. Her carrier's representative sounded cheerful until Nadine asked to remove all secondary contacts and legacy authorizations. Yes, ma'am. That'll leave only you as the primary account holder. No one else will be able to make changes. That's the idea, Nadine said. By mid-afternoon, her bank accounts had new PINs. The CPA's office confirmed her new security phrase, something she could remember but Todd never would. What's earned is owned. At 4 o'clock, Joan arrived, laptop under her arm, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Let's fortify the perimeter," she said, half joking, half not. Nadine gestured toward the study. "The field's yours?" Joan plugged in a small, sleek device, a matte black drive that looked ordinary until its light blinked to life. "Digital Legacy Vault," she said, typing with surgical precision. "Encrypted. Dual authentication. Fingerprint and executor code only. When you're gone, your designated fiduciary gets the key. Until then, no one can touch it. Not even me." "Perfect," Nadine said. Joan looked up. "You know, most clients your age don't even use cloud storage." "Most clients my age didn't have a sun file for their sanity," Nadine replied dryly. Joan smiled. "Fair point. They spent an hour transferring documents, the court rulings, affidavits, power of attorney records, banking statements, medical evaluations, Nadine's entire legal life reduced to data, each file labeled with the kind of precision that made Joan shake her head in admiration. "Nothing misplaced," Joan said softly, "not even a comma." "I don't misplace things," Nadine replied. "That's how people get rewritten." When they finished, Joan sealed the vault with a thumbprint and a faint chime. "Done," she said. "Now, even if Todd tries to claim you're being manipulated, the record's untouchable. And the record is you." Nadine nodded. "That's the only version that matters." Before leaving, Joan handed her a small card with a name printed on it. Rebecca Lively, CPA, Fiduciary Services. "She's the backup power of attorney," Joan said. "Independent, licensed, zero family ties. I already drafted the notarization. Just sign here." Nadine took the pen, pressed it to paper, and wrote her name in steady ink. The moment the notary's stamp clicked into place, the final thread tying Todd to her finances disappeared. It was a strange feeling, lighter but lonelier too, like changing the locks on a childhood home. That night, the house hummed differently. Joan had arranged for a security service to install motion lights, a new keypad entry, and a private monitoring line connected directly to the precinct. The technician, a polite young man named Marcus, finished the setup and offered a kind smile. "No one gets in without your say-so, Mrs. Langford." "Good," she said. "That's how it should have always been." When the door closed behind him, Nadine walked the perimeter herself, each room quiet, the walls humming faintly with a new kind of protection. She sat at her desk and opened her email one last time. At the top of her inbox, a social media notification glared like a mosquito in the dark. Brittany Langford posted, "We tried everything. She chose isolation. Sometimes love means letting go." Nadine read it once, expression unreadable. The phrasing was performative, carefully designed for sympathy. She could almost hear Brittany rehearsing it in her head before posting. She hovered her cursor over delete. Then she stopped. Instead, she took a screenshot, printed it, and slid the page into a sleeve. On the top tab, she wrote in careful ink, "Public record. Spin control." As she filed it, her phone chimed again. An alert from her security system. New device access detected. Unauthorized attempt. Her heart didn't race. Her breath didn't quicken. She simply tapped the screen, reviewed the log, and saw the address of the failed login attempt. Todd's zip code. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Then she clicked block permanently and whispered, not bitterly, but with a quiet authority that felt like armor, "You don't have access anymore." The system chimed. Action complete. Nadine leaned back in her chair, the light from her monitor reflecting off her glasses, her reflection split between shadow and calm resolve. Outside, the wind moved through the magnolias again, soft, persistent, impossible to silence. And somewhere in the glow of that small Charleston night, she realized Todd could no longer touch her money, her mind, or her narrative. But what he might still try to reach, what he'd never been able to own, was her legacy. The ballroom of the Charleston Legal Association wasn't built for applause. It was built for conferences. Neutral carpeting, cold water pitchers, the hum of projectors cycling through PowerPoint slides about fiduciary law. But this morning, something different hung in the air. Rows of attorneys, case managers, and elder care advocates filled every seat. Some took notes. Some just stared, intrigued. At the podium stood Nadine Langford, 73 years old, in a navy jacket and a strand of pearls that caught the light like punctuation. The banner behind her read, "When Family Files Against You, a Legal Survival Blueprint." Her voice, when she began, was calm and deliberate. "When this all started," she said, "I wasn't confused. I was cornered. And there's a difference." The room quieted further. Even the hum of the ceiling vents seemed to dim. Nadine continued, her hands resting lightly on the podium. Guardianship law was designed to protect the vulnerable. But sometimes the threat doesn't come from strangers. It comes from people who say they love you, people who assume affection grants them ownership. A few heads nodded. Someone in the back murmured agreement. "I learned," she said, "that protection doesn't mean passivity. When they tell you to stay quiet for your own good, what they really mean is stay still while we move the pieces." Her slides appeared. Simple, precise, color-coded just like her binders. Step by step, she walked them through the process: notarization, medical affidavits, affidavits of competency, sequential documentation, and chain of custody for every record. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't linger on emotion. She made survival sound procedural because for her, it had been. At one point, a younger attorney raised his hand. "Mrs. Langford, what was the most important document you filed?" Nadine smiled faintly. "The one I wrote before any of it began. My own notes. Facts in my handwriting. Because memory fades, but ink doesn't." Laughter rippled lightly through the audience. Then she paused, leaning forward just enough to reassert the weight of her words. "If they try to take the pen," she said, "make sure the paper speaks." The phrase landed. A stillness swept the room, then a burst of soft, respectful applause that built into something genuine. Afterward, as attendees lined up to thank her, Nadine kept her composure. Compliments were handed to her like trophies. "Brilliant presentation. I'm sharing this with my department. You've changed how I'll counsel clients." But she didn't glow with pride. She just nodded, the way someone does when acknowledging work finished, not glory earned. When the last person left, Joan approached from the side of the room, carrying her ever-present briefcase. She grinned. "You realize that quote's going to outlive us both, right?" Nadine raised an eyebrow. "Good. Maybe it'll outlive arrogance, too." Joan laughed, low and satisfied. "You were extraordinary. Half those lawyers are rethinking their intake procedures." "Then it was worth the hotel coffee," Nadine replied dryly. They walked out together into the crisp afternoon, where a journalist from the Carolina Record waited near the steps. Young, eager, recorder already in hand. "Mrs. Langford?" she asked. "Could I quote you anonymously for an upcoming piece on elder financial manipulation?" Nadine exchanged a glance with Joan. "Anonymously?" The reporter nodded. "Your case could help expose how common these filings are becoming. We'd change your name." Nadine hesitated only a moment. "Then yes," she said, "if it helps someone prepare before they're targeted." A week later, the article ran, "The Guardian Game: How Adult Children Exploit the System They Claim to Protect." The story detailed her strategy. Every layer of documentation, every boundary reclaimed. Her quote closed the piece in bold italics: "If they try to take the pen, make sure the paper speaks." It spread online faster than either of them expected. Law firms referenced it. Elder care blogs reposted it. One advocacy group even printed it on bookmarks. Joan forwarded Nadine the link with a note. "You've become a citation." Nadine replied simply, "Let the record show." But the internet wasn't the only place it traveled. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Todd Langford opened the business section of his paper in a downtown cafe. His face drained as he saw the anonymous quote and the unmistakable outline of events he thought he'd buried under embarrassment. The story didn't name him, but it didn't have to. Charleston was too small, and his silence too loud. He folded the paper carefully, stared at his untouched coffee, and made no call, no post, no response. That afternoon, Joan's phone buzzed while she was reviewing files in her office. A message from a contact at the Department of Revenue. Subject: Confidential. Langford. Todd H. Jones' brows furrowed. She opened it and read the single line inside. Audit notice issued. Financial activity flagged during guardianship petition period. Investigating for irregular fund transfers. She leaned back slowly, the paper rustling in her hand. Then she looked out the window toward the harbor, where the water glinted under late sunlight. The same color as the steel in Nadine's eyes when she said evidence doesn't lose its temper. For a long moment, Joan just sat there, listening to the faint hum of the city, the distant call of a ship horn, the quiet rhythm of justice taking its own time. Finally, she picked up her phone and typed a single text. To Nadine. Message. The IRS just took the pen. Nadine's reply came a minute later. Good. I hope the paper speaks. The following spring arrived clean and golden, the kind of Charleston morning where the air smelled faintly of magnolia and salt, the kind that made the world feel newly notarized. Nadine Langford sat at her kitchen table, a fresh stack of papers beside her. Each one a deliberate closing, each signature a quiet punctuation mark on what she'd built and defended. She was finalizing her estate. The pen glided with practiced ease, her handwriting as steady as her conviction. Home, retirement accounts, trust distributions, every asset cataloged, every clause reviewed twice. The language was airtight, clear enough to outlive interpretation, precise enough to silence opportunists. Todd and Brittany's names did not appear once, not in the trust, not in the will. Not even in the acknowledgments section Joan had suggested adding, for legal completeness. Instead, she'd written a single line under disinheritance provision. Omissions are intentional and irrevocable. Joan sat across from her, reading each page as Nadine signed. Her red pen hovered occasionally, but there was little to correct. "You've drafted half of this better than I could," she said with a dry smile. Nadine looked up, her tone even. "I used to grade graduate theses. You learn to recognize flawed logic fast." They shared a quiet laugh. It was the easy kind. Earned, not borrowed. "Who's handling the grandchildren?" Joan asked, scanning the distribution chart. "Third-party trustee," Nadine said. "A fiduciary service in Savannah. The funds released for education only, no direct transfers." "Good," Joan replied. "Keeps emotion out of the equation." "That's the idea." When they finished, Joan stacked the final page and reached for her stamp. The sound, thunk, thunk, echoed like a gavel through the still house. "That's it," she said. "Your estate's locked down tighter than Fort Knox. No appeals, no loopholes." Nadine exhaled through her nose, steady. "Then I suppose that's the last thing they'll never control." Joan smiled softly. "That's everything, Nadine." "Not quite." She rose from her chair and crossed to her desk, opening the small lockbox drawer she'd always kept in the corner. Inside were labeled folders, color-coded like chapters of a lifetime. She pulled out a new file, slipped the executed documents inside, and wrote the final label in calm, black ink. Case closed. No successors listed. Her hand didn't tremble. Outside, the spring wind rattled the magnolia leaves against the window pane, soft, steady, approving. By summer, word of her case had rippled through the state's legal circles. It became a quiet legend, the Langford precedent. At the Charleston School of Law, her story was now a case study in elder protection courses. Attorneys cited her filings as the Langford method, a model for documentation integrity. Judges quoted her own words from the article. If they try to take the pen, make sure the paper speaks. Nadine never attended the panels or interviews. She preferred her victories archived, not applauded. Every few weeks, Joan would stop by with updates. "They're teaching your case again," she'd say. "Apparently, you're inspiring a whole generation of lawyers who like their facts bulletproof." Nadine would smile faintly. Then at least something useful came of it. Sometimes, though, Joan would find her sitting quietly on the porch, eyes turned toward the harbor. There was no bitterness there, just the reflective calm of someone who had seen how easily trust could be rewritten and had learned to hold the pen tighter. "You ever think about calling him?" Joan asked once as the sun dipped low. Nadine shook her head. "The court already heard my testimony." That was the end of it. In late July, she visited her bank one last time. The same clerk who'd notarized her earlier filings greeted her with a bright smile. "Still keeping us on our toes, Mrs. Langford?" "Just making sure the future stays where it belongs," Nadine replied. The clerk handed her a fresh deposit slip. "Anything else you need today?" Nadine paused, then slid across a small sealed envelope. "Just to file this in my safe deposit box." He nodded, placing it carefully inside the vault. The label, in her precise handwriting, read, "Legacy, do not open until executor present." When Nadine stepped back outside, the sunlight caught her just right, sharp against her glasses, turning her silver hair almost white. The air smelled like rain before a storm, but there was no fear left in it. That night, as she walked through the house, her house, she moved room to room, turning off each light in order. Study, kitchen, hall, living room. Each click of a switch sounded final, measured, controlled. In the study, she paused before the shelves where her binders lived. 30 of them now, each one perfectly aligned, each tab whispering the same truth. Order was the purest revenge. Her eyes lingered on the top shelf, where one new binder gleamed brighter than the rest. Estate. Final. She opened it just once, not to check or edit, but simply to admire the symmetry. Then she closed it gently, locked the drawer, and exhaled. In the morning, Joan would notarize the last witness signature, and the entire Langford estate would be fully shielded, legally, financially, historically. And Todd, no matter how many years passed, would find nothing left to reach for. As Nadine turned off the final light, the house settled into darkness. A safe, deliberate silence. Outside, the wind rose, brushing through the magnolias like the faint rustle of paper. Her story was finished, but the record remained. What she didn't know, what neither of them yet realized, was that somewhere in downtown Charleston, an IRS investigator had just printed Todd Langford's audit file, highlighting a single suspicious transaction that tied directly to the guardianship petition year. And at the bottom of that page, circled in red, was the line, "Beneficiary Inquiry, account linked to deceased father's trust." The investigation had just begun. The voicemail came late in the evening, long after the sky had gone soft and blue-gray over Charleston. The screen blinked once, illuminating the quiet of Nadine's study. Unknown caller. She already knew who it was. She let it play out without sound, just the pulsing red light, waiting for her to care. When it stopped flashing, she tapped delete without listening. Not a replay. Not even a glance at the transcription. Some things didn't deserve to echo. Outside, the garden shimmered under porch light, the same magnolia trees that had watched her weather every version of her son's ambition. She slipped her cardigan over her shoulders and stepped out barefoot onto the flagstone path, the night air thick and fragrant with spring. In her hand, she carried a printed copy of the power of attorney she'd once held over Todd. The paper was slightly creased from years in her file. Official, notarized, ironclad. It had been the weapon that turned his accusation into his undoing. She paused beside the hydrangeas, their blooms pale in the moonlight. The sound of distant crickets filled the space between thoughts. Then, for the first time in a long time, she smiled. Not out of victory, but out of peace. Control, she whispered, was never about having it. It was about knowing when to release it. The paper crinkled softly as she fed it through the shredder she'd brought outside, a small portable one Joan had once jokingly called the confessional. The blades hummed, clean and efficient, slicing the last legal tether between mother and son into ribbons. The fragments drifted into the trash bin like pale confetti. For a moment she stood there, hands empty, the humid night pressing close around her. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like closure. The next morning, Joan arrived as promised, parking neatly beside the garden gate. She carried a slim leather folio, sunlight glinting off its brass corners. "Delivery from your favorite law firm," she said, stepping inside. Nadine met her at the door, coffee already brewing. "Everything in order?" "Better," Joan replied, placing the folio on the dining table. Laminated, sealed, cross-referenced. The full record. Petition, dismissal, audit notice, the whole saga in binding that will outlast both of us. Nadine raised an eyebrow. "Do I even want to see it?" "You don't need to," Joan said. "But someday, someone will. And they'll see exactly how you turned paper into power." She handed over a second envelope, this one labeled in silver ink, Langford Case, court-certified copies. Nadine ran her fingers along the edge. The material felt oddly alive, humming with finality. "And these go where?" Joan gestured toward the hall. "Where everything else that matters already lives." Together, they walked into the study. The air was cool and faintly scented with lemon oil. Nadine opened her lockbox vault, the same one Joan had once called the memory bunker. The click of the lock was quiet, deliberate. Inside were 3 shelves of perfectly aligned folders. She slid the new documents onto the middle shelf, just beneath the one labeled Estate, Final. Then she affixed a new brass label to the vault door in her steady hand, Public Memory, Private Power. When she closed it, the reflection of her own face shimmered faintly on the brushed metal, clear, unflinching, content. Joan exhaled softly beside her. "It's strange," she said. "I've filed hundreds of cases, but none that felt this complete." Nadine smiled faintly. "Completion is rare. Most people confuse it with closure." Joan gave a small nod. "You've built something unbreakable." Nadine turned toward her friend, voice quiet but sure. "Not unbreakable. Just documented." They shared a look, the kind that needed no words. Then Joan squeezed her shoulder, whispered, "You're officially history," and left her to the silence. The day passed gently. Sunlight drifted through the lace curtains, tracing slow patterns across the room. Nadine spent the afternoon tending her garden, trimming roses, refilling bird feeders, adjusting the symmetry of potted ferns the way she used to balance ledgers, meticulously, with care. By evening, she returned to her study one last time. On her desk sat a manila envelope she hadn't touched yet. It had arrived that morning, forwarded from Joan's office. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter on thick paper from the American Journal of Elder Law. "Dear Mrs. Langford, We are preparing a new edition of our textbook, Ethics and Exploitation in Aging. We'd like to include your story, anonymously, as a case study in modern guardianship law. Your methods have already influenced national training standards. We'd be honored to cite your approach under the working title, The Langford Principle. Nadine traced the words with her fingertip. Anonymous suited her. She had no interest in fame, only in accuracy. She folded the letter neatly, placed it back in its envelope, and tucked it into her vault. Then she turned to her desk drawer and found one last document. Todd's audit notice, the one Joan had printed weeks ago. She looked at it a long while, the government seal sharp in the corner. She didn't smile this time. She simply whispered, "The record speaks for itself." Outside, twilight deepened over the magnolias. Nadine sat back, eyes drifting toward the window where fireflies blinked like errant stars. Her life was quieter now. Fewer calls, fewer letters, but more peace than she'd ever expected. She reached for her tea, its warmth curling up through the air, and opened her journal to the final page. In her clean, careful script, she wrote the last line her story deserved. Nothing flowery, nothing wasted. He brought me to court to prove I'd lost control. I left with proof he never had it. She capped the pen, closed the book, and set it beside the lamp. And for the first time in years, she didn't check the locks before bed.